Wayne Bertram Williams was born on May 27, 1958, in Atlanta, Georgia, to Homer and Faye Williams, both educators. His parents raised their son with discipline and a thirst for knowledge. The family lived in the southwestern part of the city, and Wayne's childhood was relatively comfortable, which later made his story particularly controversial for the public. From an early age, Wayne showed an interest in radio technology and journalism. He built a transmitter himself and started a small amateur radio station, through which he met local DJs and reporters. After graduating from Douglas High School, he tried to build a career in the music industry, promoting new artists and dreaming of becoming a producer. However, his projects were not successful, and by the end of the 1970s, Williams found himself without a steady job and living with his parents. During this same period, Atlanta was hit by a series of tragic incidents that later became known as the Atlanta child murders. From 1979 to 1981, dozens of African American teenagers and young men died under mysterious circumstances in the city. The community was in a state of alarm, and the authorities were criticized for the slowness of the investigation. On May 22, 1981, Williams first came to the attention of investigators. Police on duty on a bridge over the Chattahoochee River heard a loud splash and soon spotted his car. When questioned, the man explained that he was on his way to an audition with a singer, but the contact details he provided turned out to be fictitious. 2 days later, the body of Nathaniel Keeter, the last person to see him, was found in the river. This coincidence prompted the police to consider Williams as a possible suspect. Forensic evidence reinforced their suspicions. Fibers and hairs found on the bodies of several victims matched materials found in Williams' home and car, including a rare type of carpet and hair from his dog, a white German Shepherd. Investigators also noted that after Williams came under surveillance, the series of tragic incidents in Atlanta ceased. The arrest took place on June 21, 1981. The trial began in January of the following year and became one of the most high-profile in Georgia's history. The prosecution presented a large amount of evidence, including rare synthetic fibers, upholstery elements, and materials found in the defendant's home. A psychological profile also played a role. Williams often argued with prosecutors and behaved provocatively, which shaped the jury's image of him as a highly confrontational and controlling person. On February 27, 1982, the jury found Williams guilty on 2 counts: the murders of Nathaniel Cutter and Jimmy Ray Payne. The court sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. After Williams' arrest, the string of crimes that had plagued Atlanta for nearly 3 years came to an end, strengthening many people's belief in his involvement. However, the case remains controversial. Williams was never tried for the other 24 incidents, and some investigators, journalists, and Atlanta residents doubt that he was responsible for all of the tragic events. Some researchers believe that the authorities may have rushed to conclusions in order to calm the public and avoid racial conflict, as most of the victims were African American children. Since the late 1990s, Williams' lawyers have repeatedly filed appeals, claiming that the investigation was incomplete and possibly biased. They also claimed that the police concealed information about other suspects, including members of radical groups who were questioned at the beginning of the investigation. Prosecutors, on the other hand, claimed that the body of evidence against Williams was overwhelming and left no doubt about his guilt. In 2007, the FBI conducted DNA retests, finding a partial match between hair found on the body of one of the victims and samples from Williams. In 2010, similar results were obtained when testing samples related to 11-year-old Patrick Balthazar. However, the defense insisted that mitochondrial DNA does not allow for unambiguous identification. Controversy surrounding the case has continued for decades. In 2019, Atlanta authorities announced a re-examination of all materials related to a series of cases involving the child murders. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms emphasized that even after 40 years, It is important to verify the accuracy of the verdict and give the families of the victims the answers they are waiting for. Today, Wayne Williams continues to serve his sentence at Telfair Prison. He has been denied parole several times. His next opportunity will not come until November 2027. He continues to maintain his innocence and considers himself a victim of political and racial pressure. Lorenzo Fain was born on April 2, 1971, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into a large and extremely dysfunctional family. His childhood was marked by poverty, constant conflict, and his parents' addiction to illegal substances. The family moved frequently, relations between his parents were tense, and the children's upbringing consisted of punishment and excessive strictness. At an early age, Fain experienced serious psychological trauma, which, according to experts, had a significant impact on his mental health and development. Lorenzo did not do well in school, often skipped classes, dropped out early, and spent a lot of time on the streets. As a teenager, he turned to crime, engaging in petty theft and carjacking, which led him into the juvenile justice system. In the reformatory, experts noted his low intelligence level, with an IQ in the range of 68-75, which fell into the category of borderline mental retardation. After several years under supervision, Fain was released in the late 1980s and moved to East St. Louis, Illinois, where he settled with his grandmother, Nellie Willis, hoping to start a new life. However, he was unable to adapt to normal life. Without an education or stable job, and with emotional instability and behavioral problems, Lorenzo soon came under suspicion for a series of serious crimes that occurred between 1989 and 1993. All of the incidents were related to attacks in the small area of East St. Louis where he lived. The investigation revealed that Fain may have been involved in several violent acts that resulted in the deaths of people, including young residents and children. In 1993, the police arrested him after another crime, and the subsequent examination allowed several unsolved cases to be solved. During questioning, Fain admitted that he committed the attacks in the heat of strong emotional outbursts and internal instability caused by a difficult childhood. His confessions became key evidence in the case. The trials in the Lorenzo Fain case took place in several stages. The first trial took place in 1994, when he was found guilty of the death of a child. The prosecution demanded the maximum penalty, emphasizing the systematic nature of his actions, while the defense insisted on life imprisonment, pointing to the defendant's mental disorders, traumatic life experiences, and limited mental capacity. Lorenzo's grandmother appeared in court to ask for leniency, which made a strong impression on those present. The jury was unable to unanimously support the death penalty, and the court replaced it with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Later, in 2001, Fain was convicted on several other counts related to the tragic events in East St. Louis and received the death penalty. However, in January 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan, citing numerous errors and violations in the judicial system, declared a moratorium on the death penalty and commuted all death sentences in the state to life imprisonment. Thus, Fain's sentence was reviewed, and he remained in prison without the right to parole. In 2009, new DNA tests linked Fain to another unsolved case that occurred in the late 1980s in Milwaukee. After additional questioning, he confirmed his involvement. Despite this, the authorities did not issue a new sentence, as Fain was already serving a life sentence. Today, Lorenzo Fain is being held at the Menard Correctional Center. He spends most of his time in isolation, occasionally communicating with psychologists and spiritual mentors. According to experts, he suffers from severe personality disorders, combining impulsiveness, emotional swings, and reduced self-control. Interviews he has given over the years show a complex mixture of regret and incomprehension. He acknowledges that he has done irreparable harm, but is not always able to rationally explain his actions. Derek Todd Lee was born on November 5, 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana. He grew up in a poor African American family living in an area with high unemployment and crime rates. His mother, Florence Lee, gave birth to her son at the age of 17 and raised him with her stepfather, Coleman Barrow, who became a father figure to the boy. His biological father, Samuel Ruth, suffered from severe mental illness and exhibited aggressive behavior, which led him to leave the family. Lee's childhood was difficult, which greatly affected his development. He was a withdrawn, irritable child who found it difficult to communicate with his peers. At school, he was placed in special classes due to learning difficulties, and test results showed an IQ of 70-90. Teachers noted his hyperactivity and signs of social maladjustment. As a teenager, Derek often got into trouble, first for petty theft, then for fighting and trespassing. At the age of 13, he was arrested for the first time for attempted burglary, and by the age of 16, he had a reputation as a troubled young man prone to risky behavior. Relatives recalled that he was obsessively attentive to women and often watched his neighbors for long periods of time, which later became one of the disturbing traits of his character. In 1987, at the age of 19, Lee married his girlfriend Jacqueline "Jackie" Sims. The couple soon had a son and a daughter. The young family moved to Zachary, where Derek worked as a pipe fitter and truck driver. However, the marriage proved unstable. Lee often quarreled with his wife and sometimes left home. In the early 1990s, Jacqueline filed a court order for a restraining order after conflicts in the family. At the same time, Lee repeatedly came to the attention of the police. He was arrested for theft, peeping, and trespassing. He served several short prison terms, but after his release, he returned to his old ways. In the mid-1990s, he moved to another part of Louisiana, hoping to start a new life, but soon found himself involved in new crimes. By the end of the decade, Lee was living a double life. On the one hand, he appeared to be a friendly, quiet neighbor, participating in church activities and helping relatives. On the other hand, he continued to exhibit disturbing tendencies towards stalking women. Female residents of the county repeatedly reported a suspicious man in a gold car to the police. But for a long time, these complaints were not linked to the same person. From 1998 to 2003, a series of attacks and disappearances of women occurred in the Baton Rouge and Lafayette area, causing public outcry. The victims were of different ages, and for a long time the police were unable to establish a connection between the cases. The investigation was complicated by the fact that at the beginning of the investigation, it was assumed that the perpetrator belonged to a different racial group, and because of this, hundreds of incorrect suspects were investigated. Only later did DNA analysis establish that the perpetrator was African American, which completely changed the direction of the investigation. In 2002, Lee attacked a woman named Diane Alexander, who managed to survive and described in detail the appearance of her attacker and his car. Based on her testimony, a photo fit was produced, which played a key role. Investigators soon established a match between Lee's DNA and material found at several crime scenes. On May 27, 2003, Derek Todd Lee was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia. He tried to hide by moving between Michigan, Illinois, and Georgia, but was found and extradited to Louisiana. The investigation proved his involvement in at least 7 cases of women's deaths, including Gina Green, Geraldine DeSoto, Charlotte Murray Pace, Pamela Kinnamore, Trinisha Collum, Carrie Yoder, and Randy Mabroyer. He was also suspected of a number of other incidents in the same region. Walter Earl Ellis was born on June 24, 1960, in Holmes County, Mississippi, to Leroy and Maddie Ellis. He was one of 6 children. In the mid-1960s, the family left the rural South and moved to the industrial city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, hoping to start a new life. However, difficulties in adapting, poverty, and strained family relationships had a noticeable impact on the boy's character. From an early age, Ellis displayed a quick temper and disobedience. Teachers and neighbors described him as a withdrawn but irritable child prone to conflict. Already in elementary school, he fought with other children and exhibited problematic behavior. After 8th grade, he dropped out of school due to poor grades and frequent truancy, effectively ending up on the streets. At the age of 14, Ellis was arrested for the first time for robbery, but as a minor, he avoided serious punishment. In the following years, he repeatedly came to the attention of the police for theft, possession of illegal substances, and assault. Despite regular arrests, the punishments remained lenient, and Ellis quickly returned to his former lifestyle. By the end of the 1970s, he had become known in the neighborhood as a petty offender associated with street gangs and the criminal underworld. Throughout the 1980s, his life was spent between short prison terms, odd jobs, and living on the streets. During this period, Ellis became addicted to illegal substances. He joined a street gang called the Brothers of Struggle and was involved in illegal activities. Due to his constant offenses, he was repeatedly sent to prison. In the early 1990s, Ellis was even used as a police informant in the hope that he would help solve cases related to drug trafficking, but the cooperation was short-lived. By the mid-1990s, Ellis had become a chronic lawbreaker, repeatedly convicted of theft, assault, and extortion. After his release in 2001, he tried to find work as a handyman and security guard, but due to his criminal past, he never stayed anywhere for long. He lived on the outskirts of Milwaukee, frequently changed residences, and maintained ties with old acquaintances from the street scene. The series of tragic events later associated with his name began in 1986 and continued for more than 20 years. The victims were women, mostly from socially vulnerable groups, many of whom had difficult lives. All the incidents took place in the northern part of Milwaukee, and for a long time, the police believed that they were unrelated. It was only in 2009, after extensive DNA analysis, that investigators determined that these crimes had a common suspect. At the same time, it was discovered that Ellis's biomaterial samples, which should have been in the database, had been mistakenly not preserved, a violation that prompted an internal investigation. When the police obtained a new sample of his DNA from saliva found on a toothbrush, the results matched the material collected at the scenes of 9 crimes committed between 1986 and 2007. Ellis was placed on a wanted list and was arrested on September 7, 2009, at a motel in Franklin. He was there with his girlfriend, who was unaware of his criminal past. A small amount of illegal substances was found on him at the time of his arrest. The investigation established that Ellis was involved in at least 7 tragic cases involving women aged 19 to 41. Among them were Deborah Harris, Tanya Miller, Irene Smith, Florence McCormick, Sheila Ferrier, Joyce Mims, and Whitrian Stokes. He was later linked to other incidents, but no official charges were brought against him. After his arrest, it was discovered that 2 men, Chauncey Dean Ott and William Avery, had been wrongfully convicted because of his actions. Their DNA did not match the evidence found at the crime scenes, and after a review of the cases, both were released. These cases became symbols of judicial errors associated with the lack of modern forensic methods. Charles Jackson Jr. was born on February 12, 1937 in Louisiana, into a poor family with many children. His early years were spent in the harsh conditions of the southern hinterland, where life was complicated by constant financial difficulties and conflicts at home. His father abused alcohol and was often harsh with his children, while his mother struggled to support the family by working on farms. When Charles was a child, the family moved to Mississippi, where he spent most of his childhood. Relations with his parents remained tense, and from an early age, the boy showed irritability, distrust, and a tendency toward aggressive outbursts. Jackson did poorly in school, often skipped classes, and had a reputation as a difficult teenager. In the early 1950s, he dropped out of high school. At the age of 16, he was arrested for the first time for theft, marking the beginning of his long criminal career. After several arrests for minor offenses, Charles finally embarked on a path of crime. In the late 1950s, he moved to California with his mother, hoping to start over, but soon found himself back among street criminals. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Jackson was repeatedly arrested for theft, assault, and other serious crimes. He often changed addresses, worked odd jobs, and frequently ended up behind bars. According to investigators, Jackson had a dual nature. In everyday life, he seemed quiet and withdrawn, but in stressful situations, he could display flashes of aggression. Psychological examinations showed signs of personality disorder, but he did not undergo treatment. After serving another sentence, Jackson was released on September 12, 1981, and moved in with his mother in the Montclair neighborhood near Oakland. Neighbors described him as a withdrawn but polite man who did not have a steady job and rarely socialized with anyone. He seemed to lead a quiet life, but it was during this period that a series of crimes associated with his name began. According to the investigation, from 1975 to 1982, Jackson was involved in at least 7 tragic incidents in the San Francisco Bay Area. His victims were women of various ages, from teenagers to the elderly. Most of the attacks took place in or near homes. The criminals' behavior was spontaneous, but these cases had one thing in common. The actions were directed against random victims and were impulsive in nature. The investigation focused on the case of Joan Stewart, a biology teacher at City College of San Francisco. She was found dead on January 5, 1982, near Montclair. At the scene, police found an unusual piece of evidence, a piece of Canadian bacon. Investigators determined that Jackson's mother made her son this kind of breakfast every day. This coincidence, along with eyewitness accounts of a suspicious car, allowed the police to track down the perpetrator. On January 8, 1982, patrol officers stopped a car matching the description and found that it belonged to Charles Jackson. A search of his home revealed evidence that matched the clues from the crime scene. He was charged with the murder of Joan Stewart. In 1983, the court found him guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. However, in 1986, after a retrial due to procedural errors, the sentence was upheld. At that time, the police had no direct evidence linking him to other cases, although suspicions remained. It was only decades later, when advances in DNA technology made it possible to test old evidence, that it became clear that Jackson may have been involved in more crimes. In the late 1990s, Contra Costa County launched a program to review unsolved cases. In 1999, DNA analysis confirmed Jackson's involvement in the November 1981 murders of Henry and Edith Vila in Albany. The nature of the attack matched other cases linked to him. When investigators informed Jackson of the test results, he refused to leave his cell and give testimony. Since he was already serving a life sentence, no additional charges were brought against him. Kendall L. Francois was born on July 26, 1971, to Haitian immigrants in Poughkeepsie, New York. He was the second of 4 children and grew up in a family where strict parenting was combined with constant financial hardship. His father served in the army, and his mother worked as a nurse in a psychiatric center. The family was respected in the local Haitian community, and outwardly their life seemed prosperous. However, from an early age, Kendall was withdrawn and had difficulty communicating, especially with girls. While attending Arlington High School, Francois played wrestling and football. His classmates remembered him as a large but insecure young man with a quiet personality. After graduating from high school in 1989, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, where he underwent basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. His service was short-lived. 4 years later, he was discharged due to health problems related to his weight. At 6'3", he weighed about 315 pounds. After leaving the Army, he returned to Poughkeepsie, enrolled at Dutchess Community College, and began studying the humanities. Francois tried to adapt to civilian life, but encountered difficulties. In 1994, he got a job as an assistant at his former school, where he cleaned the premises and helped the staff. However, his behavior caused complaints. He was intrusive, made inappropriate jokes, and showed inappropriate attention to female students. Students nicknamed him Stinky because of the strong smell of sweat caused by chronic skin problems. He soon left the school, saying he was moving to a special education facility, but this information was later disproved. By the mid-1990s, Francois was often seen in downtown Poughkeepsie, where he socialized with women from socially vulnerable groups. Neighbors noted that he brought guests home, where he lived with his parents and younger sister. In 1996, his life began to change rapidly, and soon the city was shaken by a series of mysterious disappearances. From October 1996 to August 1998, Kendall Francois committed a series of crimes against women. His victims were 8 local residents, many of whom were in difficult life circumstances. They all had similar characteristics: white, thin build, brown hair. After meeting them, Francois became aggressive and then covered up the traces of his actions by hiding the bodies in his family's home at 99 Fulton Avenue. For a long time, the disappearances of the women were not linked, as the police believed that they may have left the city voluntarily. It was not until 1997 that Detective Bill Segrist took notice of reports from other women complaining about a client named Kendall who was behaving aggressively. The police placed Francois's house under surveillance, but there was no evidence of his involvement. In January 1998, he was arrested for assaulting a woman, but spent only 15 days in custody after pleading guilty to a lesser charge. After his release, he continued his previous life, and in the summer of that year, 2 more residents disappeared, Sandra French and Katina Newmaster. Investigators then began to suspect that all the disappearances might be connected. The decisive factor was an incident on September 1st, 1998, when Francois attacked 30-year-old Christina Salot. She managed to escape and go to the police. Her testimony matched the descriptions of the suspect, who was already under surveillance. On the same day, detectives summoned Francois for questioning. During a lengthy conversation, he confessed to the crime and agreed to show them the house. The search on Fulton Avenue shocked even experienced investigators. The house was in an extremely neglected state. The rooms were littered with rubbish, and a strong smell was noticeable even at the entrance. During the inspection of the premises, the remains of 8 women who had disappeared at different times were found. On September 9th, 1998, Kendall Francois was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. In court, he behaved calmly, sometimes even smiling when the victims' relatives expressed their outrage to him. The prosecution initially sought the death penalty, but the defense insisted on a plea bargain, a guilty plea in exchange for life imprisonment. The court agreed to avoid a lengthy trial. On August 7, 2000, the Dutchess County Court sentenced Francois to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At the hearing, he uttered a short phrase, "I just couldn't stop." His confession allowed investigators to close the cases of 8 women, but one of the alleged victims, Michelle Ison, who disappeared in 1997, was never officially confirmed. Francois served his sentence at the Attica Correctional Facility and was later transferred to the Vendée prison. His health deteriorated due to a serious chronic illness diagnosed during the trial. On September 11, 2014, Kendall L. Francois died at the age of 43. The official cause of death was complications from the disease. Harrison Frank Marty Graham was born on September 9, 1959, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and was the eldest of 5 children. He spent his childhood in a poor neighborhood of the city, where he faced difficulties with his studies and social adaptation at an early age. Teachers noted that the boy had serious problems with attention, memory, and discipline. Later, doctors suggested that he had a mild form of mental retardation. His mother claimed that her son was treated in a psychiatric facility in the early 1970s, but no official documents about this have been preserved. Despite his limitations, Graham tried to build an independent life. In his youth, He worked part-time on construction sites and in building cleaning and maintenance services. In 1979, he left his parents' home and settled in North Philadelphia, an area with high unemployment and crime rates. Gradually, he found himself in a circle of people who led antisocial lifestyles and used illegal substances. Despite his imposing appearance, tall and strongly built, his neighbors remembered him as a quiet and somewhat naive man who rarely got into conflicts and helped those around him. In the early 1980s, Graham lived on disability benefits and spent his free time playing basketball with teenagers from neighboring houses. In 1983, he rented a small apartment, which gradually became a meeting place for local residents who used drugs and stimulants. The apartment was messy and unsanitary, but his neighbors did not perceive him as a threat. He was friendly, had no criminal record, and always paid his rent on time. By mid-1986, his behavior began to change. He increasingly isolated himself, boarded up the windows, and stopped letting guests in. During the hot season, an unpleasant smell emanated from the apartment, which the residents began to complain about. The landlord demanded several times that Graham clean up the apartment, but he cited health problems. On August 9, 1987, the landlord came in person, but Graham locked himself inside and soon escaped via the fire escape. After that, the landlord called the police. When the officers broke down the door, they were met with a frightening sight. The room was completely littered with garbage and household waste. The remains of several women were found inside. Investigators had to wear masks because of the strong smell. A total of 7 bodies were found, which had been there for a long time. The police immediately issued a warrant for Graham's arrest. He was seen in various parts of the city, at a car wash, in cafes, and in shelters. But he evaded arrest until his mother convinced him to turn himself in on August 17, 1987. After his arrest, Graham immediately confessed to being involved in the deaths of several women he knew. He claimed that he was under the influence of drugs and in a state of emotional instability when he was unable to control his actions. According to him, he was not always aware of what he was doing and did not know what to do with the bodies. The victims were 7 women who lived nearby: Cynthia Brooks, 27, Valerie Jameson, 25, Mary Mathis, 36, Barbara Mahoney, 22, Robin DeShazer, 29, Sandra Garvin, 33, and Patricia Franklin, 24. Most of them knew Graham personally and visited him periodically. Harrison Graham's trial began on March 7, 1988. He waived his right to a jury trial and pleaded guilty. The prosecution insisted on the death penalty, citing the number of victims and the cruelty of the crimes. The defense, led by attorney Joel Moldowski, asked the court to take into account the defendant's mental state and his addiction to illegal substances, arguing that he could not have been fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Timothy Wilson Spencer, born on March 17, 1962, in Green Valley, Virginia, made U.S. history as the first person convicted on the basis of DNA analysis. His cases became an important milestone in the development of forensic science, forever changing the approach to criminal investigations in America. From an early age, Spencer demonstrated a difficult personality. He grew up in a poor family where his mother raised 2 sons without the involvement of their father. Timothy was quick-tempered and undisciplined, but he also had good intellectual abilities. Teachers described him as an intelligent but withdrawn teenager with a tendency to break the rules. Already in his youth, he began committing petty crimes, theft and burglary, which eventually became a habit. At the age of 15, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for the first time, and later to prison for burglary. After his release in 1987, Spencer moved into a halfway house in Richmond. By this time, he already had a reputation as an experienced offender. With no family or steady job, he began to lead a reclusive lifestyle and soon found himself the focus of police attention due to a series of mysterious attacks. Between September and November 1987, 4 high-profile murders took place in Virginia. All the cases had similar details. The victims were single women, and the perpetrator acted inside their homes. Investigators noticed that all the episodes had the same modus operandi: breaking in, strangulation, and attempts to carefully cover up the traces. These crimes shocked the residents of Richmond and neighboring counties, and the press dubbed the unknown perpetrator the South Side Strangler. The investigation was a joint effort between the Richmond and Arlington police departments. Investigators analyzed the times, locations, and circumstances of the attacks and determined that they all occurred near the home of Timothy Spencer, who was on parole. He had previously been suspected of a series of burglaries and now became the prime suspect in the investigation. On January 20th, 1988, Spencer was arrested. To confirm his involvement, a technology that was completely new at the time was used: DNA analysis. Experts compared genetic material found at the crime scenes with samples of the suspect's blood and saliva. The match was a perfect one, and this became a turning point not only in the investigation, but in the entire history of American justice. For the first time in the United States, DNA became the central evidence in court, rather than a supporting element. The trial of Timothy Spencer began in the summer of 1988 in Arlington. The prosecution presented the results of the analysis. The probability of error was 1 in 700 million. This data convinced the jury to find him guilty. The court sentenced him to the maximum penalty. 2 more trials followed for other incidents, and each time DNA testing confirmed his guilt. In January 1989, investigators determined that Spencer was also involved in the 1984 murder of a woman named Carolyn Ham. Another man, David Vasquez, had already served 5 years of an unjust sentence for this crime after confessing under pressure. After a review of the case and DNA analysis, Vasquez was fully exonerated and released. This was the first case in U.S. history where DNA evidence led to the release of an innocent prisoner. Attempts by the defense to challenge Spencer's conviction were unsuccessful. The Virginia Supreme Court upheld the legality of using DNA as key evidence, finally establishing this method in judicial practice. 6 years later, on April 27, 1994, Timothy Wilson Spencer was executed at the Greensville Correctional Center. He declined to make a final statement. Darren Dion Vann, born on March 21, 1971 in Indiana, became one of the most notorious criminals in the modern American Midwest. His arrest in October 2014 uncovered a chain of tragic events that had remained unsolved for many years. At the time of his arrest, Vann was 43 years old. His life, seemingly unremarkable, was a series of failures, isolation, and growing internal aggression, which over time turned into destructive behavior. He served in the Marine Corps, but in 1993, he was discharged with a dishonorable discharge. He later had numerous run-ins with the law, including charges of threats and assault. He spent several years in a Texas prison and, after his release in 2013, returned to Indiana, where he led a reclusive and unstable lifestyle. According to his neighbors, Vann was a reserved and unsociable man who preferred solitude. He lived on odd jobs and often changed his place of residence. After his divorce, he began to experience increasing irritability and emotional swings. It is believed that his accumulated instability and psychological difficulties were the backdrop against which his destructive impulses arose. On October 17, 2014, Hammond police discovered the body of a 19-year-old girl named Africa Hardy in a motel room. She had recently moved to the city and worked in the private services sector. Analysis of telephone data helped to quickly identify her last client, Darren Vann. The man was arrested without resistance. During questioning, he unexpectedly confessed not only to his involvement in Hardy's death, but also to 6 other cases. Moreover, Juan himself pointed investigators to abandoned buildings in Gary, where, according to him, the victims' bodies were located. These confessions shocked the investigation. Shortly before that, independent analyst Thomas Hargrove had already drawn attention to patterns in a series of unsolved crimes against women in the region, suggesting that one person might be behind them. His conclusions were ignored for a long time, until Van's words confirmed the validity of these assumptions. A large-scale investigation began. During the search, the police found the remains of 7 women who had disappeared in different years. Each story was a reminder of the weaknesses of the system, from a lack of coordination between departments to an underestimation of the threat. The investigation established that Van chose his victims from among socially vulnerable women whom he met by chance or through advertisements. He was able to inspire trust, but his actions remained unpredictable and had no clear motive. Psychologists later suggested that his actions were an attempt to assert himself against a backdrop of accumulated internal conflicts and failures. The trial lasted several years and was accompanied by numerous postponements due to defense requests, as well as discussions related to the use of the death penalty in the state of Indiana. In May 2018, Van pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for the prosecution's withdrawal of the death penalty. The court sentenced him to 7 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the trial, he remained emotionless and detached, expressing neither remorse nor anger. Lorenzo Jerome Guillard Jr., born on May 24, 1950 in Kansas City, Missouri, went down in history as one of the most notorious criminals in the Midwest, earning the nickname the Kansas City Strangler. His biography became an example of how a traumatic childhood and family violence can lead to a destructive life filled with aggression and internal conflicts. From an early age, Lorenzo was quick-tempered and prone to conflict. At school, he often got into fights, disobeyed discipline, and dropped out early. After leaving school, his life turned into a series of unstable relationships, petty crimes, and conflicts with the law. He was brought to justice several times, but due to a lack of direct evidence, he was often released. His behavior became increasingly unpredictable, especially in his relationships with women, where he sought control and domination. In the late 1970s, Guillard got a job with the city's garbage company, where he eventually rose to a management position. The job allowed him to move freely around the city and get to know its neighborhoods well. From the late 1970s to the early 1990s, a series of crimes against women occurred in Kansas City, which for a long time were not linked. The victims were members of vulnerable social groups, and all the incidents took place near places where Guillard lived or worked. For nearly 20 years, investigators were unable to establish a common link between the incidents. It was not until the early 2000s, when the Kansas City Police Department received a federal grant to re-examine unsolved cases using DNA technology, that the picture changed. The new analysis allowed them to compare samples collected at crime scenes with material taken from Guillard back in the 1980s. The match was a perfect one. The analysis linked him to 6 murders of women, including Sheila Ingold, in whose case he had previously been a suspect. Later, investigators found additional matches with other cases spanning the late 1970s to the early 1990s. Many of the victims lived just a few kilometers from the areas where Guillard worked. On April 16, 2004, the police arrested Lorenzo Guillard. This came as a shock to the town's residents. At work, he was known as a calm, even-tempered, and even friendly person. But the evidence gathered, coincidences in time, place, and DNA analysis results, painted a coherent and convincing picture. The trial began in March 2007 and was closely followed by the press. The prosecution based its case on scientific evidence and expert testimony, pointing out that Guillard's genetic material matched samples found at the crime scenes. The defense attempted to argue that the encounters were consensual, but the court found these arguments to be untenable. On March 16, 2007, a jury found Lorenzo Jerome Guillard Jr. guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the trial, Guillard remained cold and calm and denied his guilt. While in prison, he gave several interviews, including one with British journalist Piers Morgan, in which he again claimed to be the victim of a miscarriage of justice. However, investigators and experts had no doubts. Gillard was the man behind a series of crimes that had kept Kansas City in fear for 16 years. Andre Crawford was born on March 20th, 1962 in Chicago, into a dysfunctional family that lacked stability and proper care. His father left shortly after his son was born, and his mother paid little attention to her children. As a result, child welfare services took Andre and his sister into foster care. However, even there, the boy faced harsh treatment and humiliation, which left a deep mark on his psyche. He later claimed that he had been severely abused by adults, although these words have not been officially confirmed. As a teenager, Crawford began to lead a risky lifestyle. He dropped out of school, got involved with street gangs, and struggled with addictions that would later have a profound impact on his life. In the 1980s, he tried to turn his life around by joining the military, but was soon discharged due to disciplinary violations and behavioral problems. After returning to Chicago, he found himself homeless and without a steady income, sleeping in shelters and abandoned houses. During this time, he ended up in a criminal environment where he associated with people who lived on the streets. Despite his outward sociability, he became increasingly irritable and alienated, especially towards women. His first crimes took place in the early 1990s in the Inglewood neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, one of the most disadvantaged areas of the city. For a long time, the disappearances of women did not prompt a systematic investigation. Many of them were little known, had no permanent residence, and had no relatives who were willing to report them missing. Because of this, the police did not immediately see the pattern between the cases, and the area continued to live in an atmosphere of anxiety. The series of crimes spanned from 1993 to 1999. Andre Crawford acted cautiously and inconspicuously, choosing vulnerable victims whom he could easily convince to follow him. He often used abandoned buildings where he took the women. After the crimes, he often returned to the scenes, which later allowed investigators to compile a behavioral profile of him. The investigation was complicated by the fact that another criminal, Hubert Geralds, was operating in Chicago at the same time, and many incidents were mistakenly attributed to him. It was only later, with the advent of modern DNA analysis technology, that investigators were able to separate Crawford's cases from others and identify the true culprit. The key turning point was genetic testing. In 1999, when Crawford was under supervision for minor offenses, a blood sample was taken from him. A comparison with biomaterials from unsolved cases yielded a perfect match. On January 28, 2000, Chicago police arrested Crawford. During questioning, he calmly confessed to 11 murders and several assaults. His cold demeanor and lack of remorse shocked even experienced investigators. After his arrest, it emerged that Crawford had participated in volunteer programs, helping the police distribute flyers about the search for an unknown criminal, thus becoming a witness to the hunt for himself. His confessions helped to review one of the cases for which Hubert Gerald was wrongfully convicted. This episode was later excluded from the charges against the innocent man. The trial lasted almost 10 years. It was postponed due to legal disputes related to the moratorium on the death penalty in Illinois and the review of old cases. All this time, Crawford remained in the county jail, becoming the record holder for the longest period of detention without a final sentence. In November 2009, the trial began, and on December 10th, the jury found him guilty on all counts. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the trial, Crawford remained calm and showed no emotion, which caused strong outrage among the victim's relatives. The judge called him a person who posed an irreparable threat to society. Lee Boyd Malvo, born on February 18, 1985 in Kingston, Jamaica, became infamous as one of two participants in a series of sniper attacks in the Washington, D.C. area in 2002. His story is a tragic example of how a lost teenager searching for guidance and meaning can fall under the influence of an adult and become part of a series of horrific events. Malvo's childhood was difficult and unstable. His parents, Leslie Malvo and Una James, separated shortly after he was born. The family lived in poverty, moved frequently, and the boy spent years living with his mother and then with relatives. His mother, seeking to provide a better future for her son, left to work on other islands, and for a time he lived alone. It was then that fate brought him together with John Allen Muhammad, a man who became both a mentor and a source of psychological pressure. Muhammad, a former U.S. Army sergeant, was significantly older and had a strong influence. For a teenager who grew up without a father, he became an example of strength and confidence. However, this influence quickly turned into a form of dependence. Muhammad limited the young man's contact with the outside world, instilling in him his own ideas and distorted notions of justice. Malvo later said that he was under constant psychological pressure and had effectively lost the ability to make decisions on his own. In 2001, they arrived in the United States illegally. Lee had no documents, no money, and no independence. His life was completely controlled by Muhammad. He convinced the young man that their actions had a higher purpose, although in reality, Malvo was merely carrying out someone else's will. It was this period that became a turning point in his life. After his arrest in October 2002, Malvo behaved calmly and detachedly. During interrogations, he tried to take full responsibility in order to protect Muhammad, which showed how strong his dependence remained. At the trial, the defense emphasized that the young man was under the complete control of an adult and lacked emotional maturity. Psychiatrists confirmed that Malvo suffered from the effects of prolonged psychological pressure and traumatic experiences. Despite this, in December 2003, the jury found Lee Boyd Malvo guilty. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, taking into account his age but not doubting his involvement. He later pleaded guilty to several more incidents to avoid further trials. In prison, Malvo gradually realized the magnitude of what he had done. He began to express remorse, writing letters to the victims' families, admitting that there was no reason or meaning in what happened. In a 2012 interview, he said that at the time he was a blind tool in someone else's hands, and that he fully understood the horror of the consequences. Over time, Malvo's fate became the subject of legal disputes. After a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that life sentences for minors were unconstitutional, his lawyers secured a review of his case. In 2020, Virginia law allowed minors convicted of serious crimes to apply for parole after 20 years of imprisonment. Malvo exercised this right, but in 2022, his application was denied. Nevertheless, the legal proceedings continue, and the story of Lee Boyd Malvo remains an important example of how manipulation, psychological pressure, and a loss of support in youth can lead to tragic consequences. Today, Malvo continues to serve his sentence in a maximum security prison in Virginia. Mark James Robert Essex, born on August 12, 1949, in Emporia, Kansas, became one of the most controversial figures in American history. His life is a story of how disappointment, isolation, and ideological pressure can lead a person to make tragic choices. The Essex family lived modestly but happily. His father, Mark Henry, worked at a meatpacking plant, and his mother, Nellie, helped children from low-income families. Mark grew up to be a calm and responsive child. At school, he was a Boy Scout, played the saxophone, and was respected by his peers. The environment in which he grew up was relatively tolerant, and the young man did not encounter overt discrimination. This makes the subsequent turning point in his life even more striking. After graduating from high school in 1967, Essex enrolled in college but soon dropped out. In search of stability, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in January 1969. At first, he saw military service as a chance to build a future. He successfully completed his training and was appointed as a dental technician's apprentice. However, after only a few months, Mark began to encounter prejudice and injustice. For the first time in his life, he felt that his efforts were being devalued. He wrote to his family about the difficult atmosphere and complained that the officers did not take him seriously. These experiences marked the beginning of his inner breakdown. Gradually, notes of anger and alienation began to appear in his letters. In 1970, a conflict with a colleague was the last straw. Essex left the base without permission, later returned, but was soon discharged from the Army for general unsuitability. This moment became a turning point. The young man, who had previously believed in equality and justice, finally lost faith in the world around him. After his discharge, Essex moved to Louisiana. There he began to associate with activists who opposed discrimination. He began to study African history, African American movements, and human rights slogans. Gradually, he became more and more withdrawn, thinking about injustice and how the world needed change. Neighbors described him as a person who was often solitary and lost in his thoughts. He was particularly impressed by the events of late 1972, when clashes between students and police broke out in Louisiana. This episode finally convinced him that society needed change. In letters to his family, he wrote more and more about the need to fight for the truth and seek justice. At the end of December 1972, Essex left his home, writing several messages in which he mentioned that he wanted to be heard. In the weeks that followed, he became involved in the tragic events in New Orleans, where clashes with police and civilians took place. Several people died as a result of these incidents, and the city was in a state of shock. Essex was neutralized on January 7, 1973. His death ended the days-long standoff and became a symbol of the tragedy of a man who had lost faith in society and chosen the path of confrontation. After his death, his family issued a statement expressing their grief and emphasizing that Mark had been broken by a system that failed to give him hope. His story continues to spark debate among historians, psychologists, and human rights activists, discussing where the line between protest and destruction lies. Mika Xavier Johnson, a 25-year-old veteran of the Afghan campaign from Mesquite, Texas, became one of the most controversial figures in recent U.S. history. At first glance, his life seemed quite ordinary: military service, family, work, dreams for the future. But inner turmoil, psychological trauma, and a sense of injustice gradually led to the tragic events of the summer of 2016. Johnson grew up in a hard-working family, participated in the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps program, and dreamed of a military career from a young age. Serving in Afghanistan was a serious challenge for him. When he returned home, he had changed significantly. He became withdrawn, irritable, anxious, and had difficulty adjusting. His family and friends noted that he seemed to have lost interest in life. His military career ended prematurely after an internal investigation into a breach of conduct. Although he avoided serious punishment, the feelings of shame and loneliness left a deep mark. According to his friends, he showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, but did not receive the necessary professional help. Against the backdrop of emotional instability, his distrust of the authorities, and especially the law enforcement system, grew stronger. The social situation in the country exacerbated his internal crisis. In 2015-2016, the U.S. was shaken by numerous cases of police brutality, which sparked mass protests and heated debates about racial injustice. Johnson became increasingly immersed in these issues, expressing his anger and disappointment online. According to his friends, he felt that society was divided and that his generation had no voice. On July 7, 2016, a peaceful rally was held in Dallas to commemorate the victims of police incidents. Johnson arrived there with a weapon and a premeditated plan of action. The peaceful event turned into a tragedy. Panic broke out, people scattered, and the police tried to restore order. What happened next became one of the most difficult days in the city's history. Law enforcement agencies responded quickly and launched a special operation that lasted several hours. Negotiators tried to convince Johnson to stop resisting, but he refused, saying he was acting out of protest against the system. When it became clear that the situation had reached an impasse, the police used a remote-controlled device to neutralize the suspect. Johnson died on the spot. This was the first time in U.S. history that law enforcement had used a robot to complete such an operation. The investigation showed that Johnson had acted alone. Records were found in his home where he discussed racial inequality and social injustice. Investigators concluded that his actions were the result of a combination of psychological trauma, ideological disappointment, and personal crisis. Despite his interest in radical ideas, no direct links to any organizations were found. The tragedy in Dallas claimed the lives of 5 police officers, and several others were wounded. The city was plunged into mourning. President Barack Obama called the incident a brutal and senseless act of violence driven by hatred. Aaron Alexis, a 34-year-old U.S. Navy veteran and civilian contractor, became the central figure in the tragic events that shook the entire country in September 2013. At first glance, his life seemed quite prosperous. Military service, a job in information technology, an interest in Buddhism, and a desire for education. However, behind this outward calm lay deep internal conflicts, feelings of loneliness, chronic stress, and growing mental health problems. Alexis was born on May 9, 1979, in Queens, New York, and grew up in Brooklyn. In his youth, he had a quick temper and did not always know how to control his emotions. Several incidents of disorderly conduct had no serious consequences, but indicated internal instability. Despite this, in 2007, he enlisted in the Navy, where he quickly settled in and rose to the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class. At first, his career developed successfully. He was disciplined, interested in spiritual practices, and respected among his colleagues. But over the years, Aaron began to show signs of irritability and emotional exhaustion. He got into conflicts, complained of overwork and misunderstanding on the part of his colleagues. In 2011, he was dismissed with honorable discharge, although according to his colleagues, the reasons were related to difficulties in adaptation and disciplinary violations. After his dismissal, Alexis took up a job in information security and was granted access to classified facilities. He traveled extensively on contract work and outwardly led a measured life. However, those close to him noticed that he was complaining more and more about anxiety and insomnia. From the end of 2012, he began to show signs of perceptual disorder. He spoke of obsessive sounds and the feeling that someone was watching him. In July 2013, he contacted the Rhode Island police requesting protection from unknown people, and then military doctors telling them about auditory hallucinations. The doctors did not see a threat and limited themselves to mild sedatives. By the fall of 2013, his condition had deteriorated sharply. Alexis frequently changed his place of residence, avoided socializing, and complained of pressure and fatigue. A few days before the tragedy, he legally purchased a hunting weapon. He had a valid permit and passed the background check without any problems. Investigators later determined that he had inscribed the weapon with messages reflecting his morbid ideas and feelings of persecution. On September 16, 2013, Alexis arrived at the Naval Shipyard in Washington, D.C., where he was on official business. At around 8 a.m., panic broke out on the premises as people reported hearing gunshots. Within an hour, the situation developed rapidly. The building was cordoned off, employees were evacuated, and a large-scale operation began. By 9:25 a.m., the incident was over and the threat had been eliminated. The investigation showed that Alexis acted alone. His actions were not related to ideology or political motives. Experts concluded that the tragedy was the result of a severe mental crisis caused by a combination of paranoia, insomnia, and internal tension. Notes were found in Aaron's home in which he described feelings of persecution and fear. Psychiatrists involved in the investigation noted that Alexis had repeatedly tried to get medical attention but did not receive timely help. This case prompted a review of systemic approaches to veterans' mental health and a review of contractors' access to high-security facilities.